Chapter 12. "And children will rise against parents," Mother said, "and have them put to death." She wasn't making much sense. Maggie and I had gotten her to take her medicine to calm her, and now our mother was just sitting there and babbling pieces of sermons. She wouldn't look at me. She kept looking at her rosary or out the back window where my father's body lay where I had beaten him to death. "Sorry," Maggie apologized as she cleaned and bound my hand. I hadn't said anything, but she knew that it hurt. She could always tell. I didn't speak. Nobody had said anything about what had happened. My mother had just screamed and screamed until Maggie had come out. My little sister had taken the tarp from the shed and draped it over our father's body before taking our mother and I each by a hand and leading us into the house. I hadn't said anything. I hadn't had to. Nobody had asked me to. Maggie had seen everything, and our mother was incoherent. In that moment, Maggie had taken charge with a gentle firmness, and just as I had become aware of the fear that had always been in our father's eyes, I now saw the warm strength that burned in my sister's. For the first time in my life, with a body in our yard and our mother in hysterics, I wasn't worried about my sister. "We have to hide it," she finally said, avoiding my eyes. I thought about it, about enlisting Maggie in some desperate attempt to hide our father's body. I thought of the places in the woods where it wouldn't be found for days. I thought of a cove I knew where the tide might sweep it away, and I thought of my strong and beautiful sister throwing her life away by aiding and abetting a murderer, by concealing patricide. "No," I said. "We have to tell the authorities." "What?" Maggie almost shouted. "That's crazy. They'll lock you up. What would that solve?" "Therefore, confess your sins to one another, and pray that you may be healed," our mother said as she fidgeted with her rosary. "We tell them the truth," I said. "Just not all of it." "They'll see your hands," she said. "The scratches." "Not if I'm not here." "You're going to run away? That's even worse!" Maggie wasn't having it. "You will be a restless wanderer of the earth." Mother quoted more scripture, and we ignored her. "No," I said, "not run away. I could enlist." She furrowed her brow in confusion for a moment. Maggie didn't like to talk much about the war or politics, and I wasn't sure how much she understood about what was going on in Europe. Apparently, she knew enough not to like the idea. "No. Francis, no!" She was starting to cry. I put my arm around her and held her close. "I'll probably have to go anyway. I'll be old enough in October." "But the war is going to be over by Christmas. Everybody says so," she argued, tears flowing freely now. "You will hear rumors of war, but not be alarmed," Mother rambled on. "Such things must happen." "Mother, stop it!" Maggie snapped. "Magda?" Our mother muttered in shock that her daughter would raise her voice to her, but she stopped talking. "Maggie, look," I said. "It's the best option. I'm going to be conscripted anyway, but this way I go on my own terms. Would you rather I rot in a jail cell while you and Mother starve? Or live on the run like Billy the Kid? But what if you're hurt? Or—" She couldn't make herself say the other. "I'd rather take the chance," I said. "This way I can at least send money home. Besides, who knows, I might just make something of myself. I could become something. That's more than could happen if I stayed." "Francis, I don't like it," she said. "I don't want you to go." "Since when has what we wanted ever made a difference?" "I don't care. We can all go away together. We can start over somewhere, she pleaded. With what money? I asked. Maggie, think. You know this is the best choice. She didn't agree, but she didn't disagree either. Her eyes drifted to my feet, and she was my baby sister again, pouting tearfully that she couldn't have her way. I put my arms around her and kissed the top of her head. After I'm gone, wait as long as you can, I said. Until tomorrow morning if you can. Then go to the police. No, I'm not going to turn you in, she argued. I'll get rid of the body. People will think he ran off. No, I told her. I don't want you getting caught covering up for me. You'd be a criminal. I won't have you paying for what I did. But Francis... Maggie, I interrupted her. I won't have it. Now promise me you won't hide him. Fine, she glared at me. I promise. I won't move him. But I won't turn you in either. All right, I said. Just go to the police and tell them that you found Father's body in the backyard. It's the truth. Then they can assume what they like. Lord knows he was mixed up in enough bad business that they won't have any difficulty coming up with ideas. But they'll want to know where you are, won't they? Tell them the truth. Tell them I left to enlist. Won't that look strange? She asked. Yes, probably, I agreed. But I'll be gone. I still don't like it, she said. I know, I agreed. I held her. I changed out of my bloody clothes. Maggie promised to burn them, and I had to take a pair of our father's slacks and shoes in order to have anything decent to wear. I didn't like wearing his things, but I didn't like having his name either, and now I supposed he didn't have any need for either of them. I took his wallet and his silver saint's medal that he'd always worn. I figured that leaving him without a wallet would make it look more likely that he'd been attacked by somebody he owed. There was barely any money in it. The silver medal of St. Francis I gave to my mother. She had bought it for Father back when they had been married. It showed the saint, hand extended to touch the head of a submissive wolf. Mother rocked silently in her chair and took the medal when I placed it in her palm. I couldn't help but notice how frail and cold her hands were. She looked up at me then, something she'd rarely done in all my life. She looked me in the face. She raised one trembling hand to my lip and traced the line there that she had been so ashamed of, so reluctant to even look at. Then the Lord put a mark upon Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. She whispered the words and reached out to place the medallion around my neck. My eyes started to sting and water as she squeezed my shoulder. She'd never shown me any motherly affection. That small touch was the only time I can remember that she expressed anything like care for me, anything like love. I didn't know how much I needed it, and it hurt now that I glimpsed it. It didn't last. She put her head down and resumed her rocking, muttering to herself. Something about sin and fathers and sons. It didn't matter. I stood up and turned away. Maggie wanted to walk with me to the train station in Fairhaven, but it was going to be dark soon and it wasn't a short walk. I wouldn't hear of her walking home alone at night. She kissed me goodbye at the front door, her arms around my neck, unwilling to let me go. It reminded me of all the times she'd held on to me like that as I'd carried her when we were younger. Now she didn't even have to stand on tiptoes to kiss my cheek. I felt her tears against my cheek as I squeezed her one last time. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. What was there to say? That I loved her? That I'd be worried sick about her every day? Should I have told her that I'd come back as soon as I could? That she was my whole world, the only person who meant a damn to me? That without her I'd have never made it this far? If she didn't know all that by then, no words could have done the job. She knew. We both did. "You're a good man, Francis." It was sweet of her to say. She must have known how badly I needed to believe it, even if we both knew it wasn't true. I'd just killed my father, and now I was abandoning my family. My father had known all along what I was. I was no good. I wiped her tears from her red cheeks with my good hand and forced a smile for her. She returned it. That's the way I think of her, even today. As a red-faced young girl with fire in her hair and tears on her cheeks. A stubborn smile matching the spirit in her watering eyes. I walked down the street and looked back once as I rounded the corner to make sure she wasn't following me. She stood by the front door watching me go, the light from the sunset competing with the color of her hair. The sunset didn't even come close. I hadn't told Maggie, but I had one last piece of business to tend to before I could leave. I circled back around through the alley and hopped the fence to another yard near our own. Goliath, old and tired, struggled to wag his tail in greeting as he limped up to me and licked my hand. I knelt in the Adler's yard and ruffled his fur, saying goodbye to the massive dog while I tossed pebbles at a bedroom window. Soon, Paul came out and joined me. "Polly, I need to ask a favor." "Holy cow, what happened to you?" he said. I hadn't thought about the bruises on my face. They were nothing in light of everything else. "Nothing, I'm fine," I told him. "I'm leaving. I'm going to join up." "Really? I'm jealous. Good for you." "I wanted to, but my folks won't let me." Paul was a little younger than me and looked it. He'd need written permission to have a chance of joining up. "So, listen," I said. "While I'm gone, I wanted to ask you to look after Maggie. Our mother isn't well and our father... well, you know." He nodded. Of course I'll keep an eye on her." "She'll need a friend," I said. "She's got lots of friends." He sounded a little jealous. "Well, she knows a lot of people, and they're nice to her, but you're a real friend, Paul. Even when you didn't have to be. I won't ever forget that." He agreed, as I'd known he would. I felt a little better knowing that there would be somebody around who cared about Maggie. Over the next few days and weeks things would be hard for her. I didn't tell Paul about that, I couldn't. But I knew he'd help her if he could. It was the best I could manage. "All right," he said, "but only until I'm old enough to join up and do my part. Don't you win the war until I get there." "It's a deal," I said. I shook his hand and hugged Goliath one last time, knowing I'd never see the old dog again, even if I did make it back there someday. I walked the rest of the way alone and slept under a tree by the train station. The passenger train down to Seattle didn't leave until the next morning. I was worried that police might show up and stop me before the train arrived, but they didn't. When the train left, I was on it. I signed up in Seattle. I'd assumed when I'd left that I'd be joining the army just as my father had before I was born. I wished I could feel a bit less like I was walking in his footsteps, like I was becoming him. I had his name, after all. I had his Medal of St. Francis. Hell, I even had his hat. Be a U.S. Marine. The poster was simple, but it was all the encouragement I needed to take a different path. Marines went to sea, traveled, saw the world. If the plan was to get away from home, then that seemed like a good way to do it. More importantly, my father hadn't done it first. I signed up on the spot, eager to leave. It took a couple of days before I shipped out from Seattle, but again, no police showed up looking for the boy who'd killed his father. I signed a bunch of forms, went through a physical, and after I satisfied all the necessary requirements, did a lot of sitting around. Other young men waited with me. Most of them came with parents or girlfriends or wives who tearfully saw them off. I sat alone and watched them, just hoping to be left alone. One young man was dressed very conservatively. His father and mother came with him, as well as a woman who immediately caught my eye. She was dressed just as modestly, they all were, and behaved demurely, but there was no hiding the fact that she was a beauty. She had golden blonde hair, fair skin, and just about the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. The four of them joined hands and bowed their heads in prayer, the older man leading them quite loudly and publicly in asking for the safe return of his son, "If it please you, Lord." While they were praying, heads bowed and eyes closed, I saw the young lady open her eyes and look around. An enchanting look of mischief on her face. She seemed thrilled to be getting away with something. Our eyes met. I wasn't used to girls looking at me, especially not girls as pretty as she was. She noticed me looking at her and didn't blush. Instead, she smiled at me and winked. Winked. At me. Then she pursed her full, pouty lips and silently mouthed, "Shh," as if I were in on something terribly scandalous with her. As the prayer was ending, she closed her eyes and bowed her head again with the rest of her circle, blending in as if she had never deviated from their pious display. The prayer ended and the man shook the young man's hand sternly and bid him goodbye. The woman embraced him in a motherly way and did likewise, dabbing at her eyes. The young woman threw her arms around the recruit and hugged him fiercely, kissing him on the cheek, until the older man cleared his throat and glared at her sternly, evidently embarrassed by such a public display. She was gorgeous. Some guys had all the luck. It made sense. He was a good-looking young man, fair-haired and well-dressed. I wondered if I could have gotten a girl like that if I'd been born with a face or family like his. After they said their goodbyes and left, the young man began looking for a place to sit. There weren't very many left, and I made a point of looking away so as not to encourage him to join me. It was too late. He'd noticed me looking and smiled cautiously, walking right up to me. "I beg your pardon," he said in a clear voice. "Is this seat taken?" I shook my head but didn't speak. He took it as a welcome and sat down beside me. He extended a strong-looking hand toward me in greeting. I winced as he squeezed my right hand, but he didn't seem to notice. "Pleased to meet you. Name's Peter. Peter Madsen. But you can call me Pete." He smiled at me expectantly. "Hello," was all I said, hoping he'd leave me alone. He didn't. He looked to be sure that his entourage had left, double-checking as if not wanting them to see what came next, before reaching into his bag and digging out a pack of cigarettes. He offered one to me. Not knowing what else to do, I took it and let him light it for me. "I thought they'd never leave," he smiled. A girl like that, and he was glad that she was gone? I took the bait. "Your family?" "Yeah, my father's a minister." "Don't get me wrong, he's a good man, but I'm looking forward to being able to breathe a little. No drill sergeant is going to come close." He laughed at his own joke, but not in an obnoxious way. He seemed like a decent enough sort. "Was that your girlfriend?" I asked, trying not to show my envy. "What?" he laughed. "Heck no." "That's my sister, Evelyn. Thank goodness. I pity the man she ends up with. If father doesn't scare them all away, that is." I'd seen scarier fathers, but kept my opinion to myself. The recruits were beginning to board. A man was calling names in the background. "Where are you from?" Pete asked, still trying to get me to talk about myself. "Montana," I said. Technically true. I had been born there. "We're from Ballard, just a little north of here. You know it?" I shook my head. "Full of Swedes and Norwegians. We fit right in," he laughed. I didn't. Maybe, if I kept quiet, he'd leave me alone. I should never have asked about his sister. The voice called another name in the distance. Pete peered over my arm at the papers I held on my lap where my name was written in bold letters. Shepard, Francis. "Isn't that you?" he asked. I hadn't heard my name called. "What?" "They called Frank Shepard. Isn't that you?" He pointed at my name. My father's name. Nobody called me Frank. My mother and sister had always called me Francis to distinguish me from my father. Francis had always sounded softer, smaller, kinder. A boy's name. To me, Frank was the name of a mean son of a bitch. A man to be feared and avoided. The kind of man who hurt people. A man I hated. "Shepard! Frank!" the voice called again. Pete raised an eyebrow at me expectantly. I stood up. "That's me,"